Let's switch over to our main topic and start talking regulation. Prior to Security Token Group, Herwig, you did start a different company called Invest Ready, which does provide compliance software for a lot of the industry. I know that this has given you an edge in understanding STOs and regulations, so I think now would be a great time for you to leverage that knowledge and share with our listeners some of the basics of fundraising here in the US.
Thank you, Kyle. I would be more than happy to, but please don't just listen to the introduction boilerplate from the podcast. I am not an attorney. People often mistake me for one because I'm very familiar with the regulations from working for so long in the equity crowdfunding industry since it really developed in 2013. That's when the first rules were legalized from the Jobs Act. And today we are not actually talking about compliance even, but actually the rules and regulations, more specifically the fundraising exemptions that private companies typically use in the United States to do an STO. So you see, as a private company, raising capital from investors requires you to register with the SEC. Instead of doing that traditional way by going public on a stock exchange, which is too costly, of course, for private companies, startups, or investment vehicles, they instead can use private fundraising exemptions that allow them, of course, to raise the capital following the varying rules of each specific exemption. So for example, one exemption allows you to publicly advertise your offering, but requires that you verify investors meet a certain financial criteria defined as accredited investor status. That's actually what my company, Invest Ready, does. It helps issuers, crowdfunding portals, even tokenization platforms verify an investor's accreditation status by providing software and a layer of support and privacy for investors to go through this process.
All right, so fundraising exemptions are what gives the issuer the way to raise money without needing to report it to the SEC. What about filing or reporting to investors? What requirements must these companies adhere to?
You're definitely asking the right questions there, Kyle, but unfortunately each exemption is unique. So when it comes to each one of those things, luckily there are only really 4 key exemptions to focus on when it comes to an STO, with one exemption offering 2 specific ways that are important. There are other exemptions as well, but to date, we haven't yet really seen many of those applied for STOs.
That doesn't sound so bad. So do you have any tricks to remember them all, or do you just kind of have to go off the cuff with it?
I am definitely can't help you there. That would be too simple, I think, for legislators and regulators. They instead, here we go, ready? They're called Regulation D, Regulation A+, Regulation S, and Regulation CF. That last one is easy enough because that CF there stands for crowdfunding. But, it just leads me to how I would recommend, I guess, since you're questioning it, how about I would group these, exemptions, probably categorizing them by the type of investor you are offering the STO to, and then the type of solicitation you plan to use.
Solicitation as in how you advertise and communicate the offering to investors, because you do have to be careful at what extent you market and advertise your offering, because different exemptions require different levels of privacy. So I'd love if we'd start there by breaking that down.
All right, yeah, absolutely. You see, for the last 80 years in the U.S., or at one point in time before the Jobs Act, the SEC had no changes to the regulations for raising capital. In fact, Regulation D accounted for 99% of all offerings in terms of volume up until the Jobs Act of 2012, which then introduced Regulation CF and Regulation A+ into the mix. But let's get back to solicitation, right? If you are planning a publicly advertised STO, I'm talking about using the internet or social media, putting a TV ad out there, or even just going to the street and starting to shout about your offering to people, then you would be soliciting and you wouldn't be able to raise money the way 99% of the private market does. So prior to STOs, the traditional way that companies raise money, and still mostly do, by the way, is by using Regulation D, but specifically Regulation D Rule 506B, right? So Rule 506B, meaning that it's a 2-parter, Kyle. Reg D is one of the 4, codified private fundraising exemptions, but you can actually look at it like there are 5 different individual regulations there that an issuer can use for fundraising in total.
All right, well, I'm holding you to that because it was 4 a few minutes ago and now it's 5.
All right, I promise, it will not increase.
All right, so we've got Rule 506B, which is Regulation D. We've got Regulation A+, Regulation X, S, and Regulation CF. That's a lot of letters. What's the 5th?
Well, the fifth one is still under Regulation D, but it's known as Rule 506C. You see, Rule 506B prohibits solicitation. You can only tell people you know in a closed room about the investment, and those individuals must qualify as accredited investors. Hence why most of finance has, and mostly still is, closed loop networks and boardroom meetings run by the elite and the old guard, right? So now, thanks to the Jobs Act, it also introduced Rule 506C to enable companies to solicit as long as they still verify that investors are accredited.
Just in case our listeners don't know, the accredited financial threshold is $1 million in net worth or $200,000 in annual income, right?
Yep, that's pretty much sums it up right there, Kyle. Thank you for clarifying that. We're basically talking about the top 10% of Americans in terms of wealth. So it's great that you can now advertise with 506C, but per your point, many issuers don't want, they also want to take money from non-accredited investors, not just accredited investors. So, also commonly referred to as retail investors.
All right, so to review so far, if you want to raise money from accredited investors and you don't need to advertise to the public, you would use 506B, which is what we've seen in the traditional markets today. That's how Facebook, Uber, Google, and all the other startups had raised their money in the past. But thanks to 506C, you can now compliantly advertise your investment to the public. However, you are still limited to only those accredited investors for the actual investment in your company.
You have got it down perfectly. And all that is required for Regulation D, by the way, is a simple filing with the SEC, no approval necessary. But just make sure you use InvestReady or any other accreditation tool, of course, for qualifying an accredited investor status.
Right. We've seen some headlines before of SEC approved STO, and in most of those cases, they're not actually approved, right? Because there's not actually an approval process.
That's right.
So that's simple enough. But if we wanted to include the everyday retail American investor, how would you do that?
Another great question. Before the Jobs Act of 2012, only up to 35 non-accredited investors could participate in a Rule 506B offering, and you had to have a previous relationship, so you couldn't even bring in new investors. So Rule 506C, by the way, also does not allow for any non-accredited investors to participate, so at least with Rule 506B, you can get up to 35. But that's obviously not scalable in any sense or the form. So instead, the Jobs Act produced Regulation CF and Regulation A+ to truly enable that equity crowdfunding concept. So both exemptions, unfortunately, do have their flaws. Regulation CF only enables up to $1 million in financing from retail investors. If you want to raise more from the crowd, the SEC improved Regulation A, hence the name Regulation A+, to allow for raising up to $50 million from non-accredited retail investors. So, the problems, though, are Reg CF is criticized as too small, and Reg A Plus is criticized because one of the requirements is that you need SEC approval. And when it comes to STOs, unfortunately, none of them have qualified for an offering yet.
Right, so that makes a lot of sense. So Reg D, you don't need approval. Reg CF, you don't need approval. But if you're looking to get that $50 million from non-accredited retail investors, that's when you need the SEC approval, and we haven't seen that yet. I do remember these issues pretty well. That's why we actually combined to give our feedback to the SEC to improve these exemptions. And it does look like they just might be making some of those amendments. So we're going to have to see in the next couple months what the SEC says about the industry feedback that we, along with many others in the community, provided and what they intend to move forward with.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's created less than $1 billion in usage for Regulation CF today, Kyle. And the additional reporting requirements for both regulations don't help either. At least both offer a way to expose to retail investors. Reg CF is starting to be used more by STOs because it is a light financial requirement. And as you pointed out, it is just an easy filing with the SEC.
Right, so it's just an easy filing, but it's only up to $1 million US dollars or $1,070,000 US dollars. So it's great, but it's just not quite scalable. So if you're looking to scale that to retail investors, it's got to be A+. But if you're okay with only taking accredited, Reg D 506C seems like it's been the most productive for STOs so far.
Yeah, I mean we're getting there, Kyle. You know, we have covered all of them except for Regulation S. So for all other people that the SEC, really doesn't control, there is Regulation S, and of course I'm talking about international investors. You see, the SEC is only interested in enforcing and protecting investors who are U.S. citizens. So Regulation S is designed to let you raise from international investors through a separate exemption. Regulation S wasn't commonly used before the Jobs Act because reaching investors all around the world was, of course, difficult without the internet. But now with an STO, that becomes incredibly easy, and Regulation S is seeing an uptick in activity as a result. So just keep in mind, though, that you should also be following the securities laws of other countries that you accept investors from in your STO.
Okay, so Regulation S is for global investors, and presumably you can advertise to them, right?
Yeah, that's right. Of course, the SEC, they don't really care what you do with international investors. They even have less stringent lockup periods following the primary sale.
So beyond filing requirements, investor criteria, and reporting requirements, issuers also need to be conscious of lockup periods.
Yeah, of course, each exemption comes with its own rules for how long a security needs to be restricted and who it can be sold to. So I think I can really end my lecture here on this message, which is speak to Securities Counsel in the U.S. if you plan to raise capital. Legal counsel is critical for any transaction. Honestly, they're your first step, and they're the ones who are responsible for helping you stay compliant. And otherwise, you are on your own. And again, I'm not a securities attorney, so I don't really know the nitty-gritties, if you will.
Yes, you definitely need to speak to an attorney if you're thinking of going through this process. But I certainly know that Security Token Advisors has a lot of great firms in their network and plenty of experience working with issuers all around the world. And so if you're looking for a legal intro, that's certainly a great place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to help there. And honestly, that's a wrap for our show this week. Those are all the different regulations that we've seen commonly get used in the industry, and you can use them in combination. So that's what you've seen most of these issuers do. Hopefully this episode was helpful and educational and that you enjoyed the show. Please feel free to give us feedback. Kyle and I can be reached on Twitter and LinkedIn. And if you have any questions or recommendations, of course, don't hesitate with those either.
Absolutely. The best way to engage with the STM community is through stomarket.com/news. There you can submit articles, comment on others, or even just scroll through the feed of the latest and greatest from the security token industry. Finally, you should know that we do post the main topic as its own episode from each podcast episode on YouTube, which allows you to quickly catch up with all of the topics that we cover and discuss each week while being able to skip over some of the news that maybe isn't quite as relevant. All 50 plus episodes are posted, so definitely feel free to go back, review some of the old content you maybe missed, or share the current ones with those that need it. Thank you so much for listening. Talk to you next week.
Catch you next week. Thanks for listening.